What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. My guest today is a senior fellow at the Institute for European Studies at University of California, Berkeley, an associate editor for the journal History and Theory, and a lecturer in history at Santa Clara University. Crucially, my guest today has been writing some amazing work on the intellectual history of international relations theory, right? Especially realism. And I've been planning for like 6 months to get this guy on the show to talk about his book with Stanford University Press called The Atlantic Realists, Empire and International Political Thought Between Germany and the United States. If you are an IR student, you have to read this book. You have to. It is by far the best IR-related book I read last year. And we're going to talk about it today. This guest is none other than Dr. Matthew Specter. What's going on, man? Welcome to the show.
Oh, great to be here. And fan of the pod. And very flattered by your opening remarks.
Yeah. This book, The Atlantic Realists, also a beautiful cover. In that book, we can just go straight into this. You note how classical realism and IR, like it only really dates to the mid-century, like 30s, 40s. But you also talk about how the realist intellectual tradition has roots in imperialism. I mean, that's part of the novelty of this book, is kind of showing or exposing those imperial roots to realism in the late 19th century. Can you talk about the origins of realism and how both these things are true?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so historians usually converge on the late 1930s up through the early 1950s as the period in which a self-consciously realist school, later dubbed classical realist once the neo-realists were on the scene, crystallized. And so I'm not, so certain landmarks like E.H. Carr's 1939 book, or of course, Hans Morgenthau's 1948 Politics Among Nations and related essays are landmarks. But you also have the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr and some other figures, some German emigres during that period. But as I was trying to historicize realism, basically what happened was I was looking at Carl Schmitt and his notions of Großraum, or greater space, and they kind of led me back to two thinkers for whom the concept of Lebensraum, or space for living, was important. And these were Karl Haushofer, the editor of a major journal of geopolitics, and Friedrich Ratzel, who coined the term Lebensraum and was a geographer. And once I got back to Ratzel, who had coined the term in 1900, I found myself in the fin de siècle, and I began to look at figures like Mahan, and I started to ask myself, what is the difference between these fin de siècle discourses of geopolitics in the era of high imperialism and the classical realist tradition? And I thought, and then there were some historians like David Milne, who call, and John Mew, who refer to Mahan as a proto-realist or an instinctive realist. So historians were already beginning to kind of build a bridge back to the turn of the century, but were reluctant to affix, to say that these were pure realists or true realists. And so what my concept of an Atlantic realist tradition is trying to do is to say that there are strong family resemblances between the discourses of geopolitics and imperialism of the 1880s and 90s, and the discourses on national interest, sphere of influence, the tragic, and so forth in the 30s and 40s. And this is important because normally the story we tell about realism is that it emerges from the failure of appeasement, the disillusionment of liberalism, the weakness of liberalism in the face of a rising fascism. And that's the story that people like Kissinger, tell, right? Is that realism flows from a crisis of liberalism, and the interwar crisis of liberalism. And by reconnecting realism to the era of high imperialism, I'm able to show that there are a different set of concerns, that are animating that project, or liberalism at a different stage of its life cycle, as it were.
Yeah. I want to circle back to Mahan another later on in the discussion,
yeah, sure.
But you argue that the Atlantic realist tradition, or Atlantic realist, was a particular strain of realism that was, the locus of it was Germany and Washington primarily, and that it viewed history as like a struggle for power. You say, quote, struggle for power, not visions of balancing prudential ethics or a sense of the tragic. These are some important distinctions to make. Like, these are different hues of realism, that like the Atlantic realist preoccupation was not power balancing. It was power projection.
Yes. I mean, I think that's right, though I'm not sure what names attach to the tradition of power projection and power balancing. So I would be, we'd have to go a little deeper on what you mean by those terms. But yes, what I argue is that realism is often, in John Bew's book and in many other contexts, encouraged by Henry Kissinger's own sort of narration of his, intellectual journey. Realism is said to descend from realpolitik. And what I found in my research, which was totally unexpected and not a starting point. So I didn't start with notions of power projection and power balancing.
Yeah.
But what I found was that for many thinkers at the turn of the century, like Max Weber and Friedrich Ratzel and Paul Reinsch, important American political scientist, realpolitik was passé. Realpolitik was about balancing, but it was about balancing sort of internal to it was balancing that was land focused. It was balancing that was oriented towards the balance of power on the continent in the case of Europe. So realpolitik was passé when it came to the era of high imperialism, where it was important to have overseas colonies and to project power through a strong navy, and hence the passion for the American thinker Mahan in Germany, right, where Tirpitz and Wilhelm II made sure that the German Navy was up on their Mahan. Broadly speaking, I'm arguing that realism descends from Weltpolitik, not Realpolitik. Weltpolitik was the term for this strong navy, overseas power projection kind of model. The only caveat I would make is that I think it would be overshooting the mark to say that 20th century realism, does not contain a balancing element or balancing tradition.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Right. So I think what I'm
rhetorically, it's central, actually. Yeah.
Right. So I'm decentering realpolitik from realism, but I wouldn't deny that a balance of power thinking is, an important ingredient of realist tradition. I don't believe that the Atlantic realists are all one thing. It's not even an ideal type. It's a shorthand that I developed for a conversation in the North Atlantic among people that contribute to a discourse that is handed down to us. And I think that we speak realism often without knowing that we're doing so. And what I'm trying to do as a historian is to, historicize a language and provincialize a language and say this isn't just a neutral scientific language, but actually a way of talking about the world that comes from the global north, at a particular moment. And a lot of it is just rehearsed and has become sedimented as common sense, and we don't question it as much as I would like us to.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's one of the things I loved about it, actually, getting that sunlight or exposure on some genealogy that is not just, like not reasoning from a genetic fallacy or whatever. Like it still has imprints today. It affects what we do today. It's relevant, in addition to being interesting historiographically. And like, it's kind of an aside, but like the balance of power rhetoric dominates DC, but the way everybody like operationalizes it is through a power projection. Because obviously, like, continental thinking is not, like, orienting toward a continental mass is not relevant in the foreign policy context for the US now. It's all about power projection, but the language is still balancing. But what they're talking about conceptually is not balance. It's forms of imbalance. And that contradiction, you're getting at something here, because that contradiction relates to conflating power projection with power balancing. And so it was interesting that you drew this distinction a little bit in the history.
Yeah, no, that sounds very productive. That's not sort of what I came in with or what I was intending to highlight. I think that my connection to Weltpolitik was more about kind of notions of America as the indispensable nation, because it's a power of the first, it's a world power, right? It's the
of the first rank,
the power of the first rank, and that language. So my argument is that an important part of realism is seeing like a world power. It's a mode of seeing, and it doesn't really interrogate its own privilege atop a global hierarchy, but naturalizes that hierarchy and then provides a kind of toolkit, the savoir-faire of empire, sort of the knowing how to be an actor on that world stage, becomes a proxy for, this is how all nations behave. These are the laws under which all nations, must conduct themselves, right? A world pre-structured by world powers that set the rules.
Yeah, I was going to ask this later, but like, there's a lot of analytical importance placed on great powers in IR theory, obviously, right? But what counts as a great power is really fuzzy and contestable. And you introduce a lot of hidden history about the obsession with being this first rank, seeing like a world power, being great, in the Imperial era, going back to the 1890s up through the Great Depression, I guess. What was in that discourse of being great, of being a great power? Like, how did thinkers of the time in America and Germany, like, what did it mean to see like a great power?
There's an explosion of references to America as a world power in the wake of the Spanish-American War and in subsequent decades. And I argue that Germany and the US are sort of looking at each other across the Atlantic for points of reference to understand what constitutes national greatness. And Rotzel has a book called The Ocean as a Source of National Greatness. So I think it has something to do with being a first-rank power. Means having colonies. It means having a powerful navy. It means being an industrial power. It also means being white and Western. So there are racial barriers to entry to the club of the great. Mm-hmm. I don't think that power can be completely deconstructed, like just by saying in the past nations spoke about themselves as great and we can deconstruct this. I believe in material power and there are significant differences of power between nations and so forth. But what interested me was this kind of, as you said, lapsing into fuzzy thinking about the constituents of great power and national greatness. And of course, it's also a very undemocratic discourse. Well, what makes the nation great has to do with the ability to project power outwards and to dominate, and has nothing to do with the internal character of the nation.
Yeah, seeing like a great power almost certainly means not seeing society, or like seeing, certainly minorities. It almost means, it almost requires you to see foreign societies as things that can be subsumed within your project.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a great deal of space for civil society connections, international civil, connections between civil society. I was reading your piece on left of liberal internationalism and these three paradigms of progressive grand strategy, and you talk about civil society connections, that for the peacekeeping tradition, which is one of your three traditions, that connections between civil society are very important, and that's quite absent from. This is a nation state centered discourse, and it's also a nation state helmed by a male statesman or an elite of people who have been trained to see a certain way, mm-hmm. and largely excludes the demos, the people.
Yeah.
So imperial blind spots was a big theme of my book, but also that realism has a democratic deficit because it puts so much weight on, acquiring the right training, the sort of what I call the realist habitus, basically the sort of set of intellectual tools and habits of thought congealed into kind of a certain kind of common sense that's very hard to dislodge. And mm-hmm. and some people are, swear by it and say, this isn't this isn't just a way of thinking. This is the hardwiring of the world, right? I mean, there are realists who would say, from Thucydides to Cotilia, Machiavelli, up to the present, that this is just the way it is. Mm-hmm. And I, as a historian, I'm uncomfortable with those kind of transhistorical generalizations.
Uncomfortable.
I'm very uncomfortable.
I just wanted to make sure
with those transhistorical generalizations, though. I don't think I try not to be naive about power and power mm-hmm. politics. We've mostly international relations, develops in a world of empires, and mm-hmm. I think that in competitive imperial dynamic is very important for understanding, the sort of racialized character of realism.
Yeah, and this is based on my personal experience partly. In like really uncertain times, deterministic reductionist thinking becomes like particularly appealing. Like the more complex shit gets, the more you find seductive the simple, here's the key that unlocks everything else. Here's how you need to read things. Here's where you need to focus your attention. And here's what matters. And I say it's personal experience because like the shit show of like Trump winning the presidency in 2016 and how like world rocking that was for a lot of us, and especially me. My first instinct when that happened was, I talked to Jeannie Moorfield recently about this a little bit. It was like, I literally went and dusted off Hans Morgenthau. Like from my PhD studies, I had Politics Among Nations and Scientific Man versus Power Politics.
Power Politics.
Yeah. And so like I dusted that shit off. I reread it. I went and got a copy of The Prince, Machiavelli. I reread it. And like that was my intellectual reaction initially when Trump won. And so, I mean, like maybe I'm overgeneralizing from my N of one here, but like there's this feeling of like dread, uncertainty, chaos. It creates an attraction to reductive thinking. And so like, I think realism benefits from that, particularly in times when liberal hegemony, liberal internationalism has lost a lot of its shine. Okay, so if the status quo is broken, what do you go to? What's the alternative? And realism is a clear, off-the-shelf, shovel-ready alternative, and I think it wins a lot from that, even regardless of its deficits. And so like part of your work is exposing some of these deficits and like, here's what you're really signing on to kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Very much so. One of the things I think is ironic about the kind of renaissance of popularity of realism, in the last 15 years of sort of, basically creating people grabbing for a meta narrative to make sense of US-China tensions, US-Russia tensions. But it's interesting because, as you said, I think people are attracted by this kind of clear and parsimonious logic of large states, hard power, rational motivations, and predictable fracture lines. And this is a reassuring source of faith that the world is knowable and masterable. And this is ironic because that's actually a kind of Enlightenment project when the realists pride themselves on being attuned to the hubris of Enlightenment, the limits of reason, the unpredictability, the unmasterability of international affairs. That's what realists are supposed to be teaching, is the fragility of reason, and yet, in some of its forms, it can be very, very, very ambitious in its explanatory claims.
Yeah. To go back to the older part of your book for a minute, or it's all old, I suppose, but the deeper history on realism, and these German-American exchanges intellectually, what was it that the German imperialists were pulling from American ideas and vice versa? Like the fact that like America inspired certain things in Germany, and particularly in Nazi Germany, was like a little jarring to me. Like maybe that's not new in the literature, but like I hadn't seen that before.
I think what Ratzel and his generation of liberal German imperialists were impressed by in America was the size of the continent, the project of settler colonialism, of having unfolded manifest destiny. And so this was an enchanting. America had successfully conquered Lebensraum for itself, and German imperialists were attracted to that as well. And Ratzel had traveled in America. Later in the book, I talk about Carl Schmitt and how Carl Schmitt, who was a brilliant political theorist and jurist and legal advisor to the Nazi Party, how he looked to the Monroe Doctrine for a model of what Hitler would call a Germanic Monroe Doctrine, an idea of a sphere of influence, a hegemony in Europe, continental Europe. From where we sit in our kind of post-Inglorious Bastards, world, where we think of Germans and Americans as very divergent and even kind of two different exceptionalist histories, and an exceptionally benign American empire and an exceptionally evil German empire. What I wanted to do was show that American and German imperialists, had a kind of mutual admiration society going at the turn of the century, and it was absolutely fascinating to me to see, before World War I, this sense of affinity that the Germans felt for the Americans and vice versa. And one of my very favorite quotes from the book is this quote from Archibald Coolidge, who was a professor at Harvard, and he wrote a book called America as a World Power in 1909. And he describes America and Germany as two young pushing firms who have yet their way to make, in contrast to England and France, which were staid old houses, right? So Germany and America were the new kids on the block, the dynamic empires. They had a common, disdain for the British and the French, and what really struck me was that in this pre-World War I period, you can see realism kind of emerge as a project of comparison. And of course, today realists still use comparison. Think of John Mearsheimer talking about the Monroe Doctrine and Ukraine. We make those kind of, or Trump saying, do you think we're so innocent, right? That sort of notion. So realism, I think, has a kind of comparative imagination, and I wanted to show, two of the protagonists who felt their national experiences were comparable, even though later history has encouraged us to divorce those two countries and put them in different boxes. Yeah.
No, it was fascinating the amount of mutual admiration you documented. Like, I would have never... I knew there were some inspirations of Jim Crow and Nazi Germany and stuff, but like, you went way further. It's fascinating.
For Americans of the late 19th century, Germany was the center of high culture and specialized scientific learning, the most advanced universities, and so forth. So there's also that connection.
A lot of people who listen to the pod are probably familiar with Alfred Thayer Mahan. Some of them will be familiar with him in like a value neutral way, but he was this is not throwing shade at the man. I'm not saying this as a judgment, but like, he was descriptively a militarist and imperialist, and that is not necessarily at odds with the vibes that were going on at that time. But can you, the idea that he would have like a values laden worldview, I mean, whose worldview is not values laden, but like, it cuts a contrast with the notion of like him being a hard-headed or the proto-realist, as you say, right? Or not you say, but others say. So like what was the values dimension of somebody like Mahan?
Yeah, I mean, he basically believed in the superiority of the Americans, the British, and the Germans, and sometimes he cleaved more to the American-German connection, and other times more towards Great Britain. But you know, he would describe the Caribbean, you know, as the great nerve center of European civilization. Right? He believed that it was important for the U.S. to control the Panama Canal in order to essentially defend the Pacific coast from, you know, the Asiatic hordes. So yeah, it's the civilizational discourse, the Christianity, the Orientalism. It's all very pronounced in Mahan. But I really think that Mahan has been unappreciated as a seminal realist thinker. You know, I think that if you read Mahan, I call attention to a phrase that he uses over and over again, that of things be, you know, of the nature of things, that there's an ontological reality of international relations that you just have to understand. And when Mahan critiques, you know, treaties and arbitration, it's always in terms of the notion that interests are not adjudicable, and that the term. So I talk about vitalism a lot. I think we you know, today we talk about vital national interests, but there's a lot of discussion of the sort of unmasterable life force, you know, of a nation as a growing organism that simply, you know, needs, you know, it's in its nature to expand, and you know, international relations has to kind of work around that, lest it, you know, be unrealistic.
Yeah, I mean, the salience here is, like I say, I'm not throwing shade at him. He had a particular view of what social order was, civilization, racial hierarchy, right? The maintenance of colonies. His ideas about military strategy and about great power politics, his own IR theory, basically, those things don't have any kind of meaning shorn from his view of social order. So like, well, why do you need to have great battles to win some struggle to be in power of the first rank? Well, it's because so that you can maintain your colonies. Well, why? Because that's how we preserve a hierarchical racial order. Well, why? Because that's as God intended, or like, you know, whatever, like, because that's what's vital, you know? And so like, we've tried, especially you go to a place like Naval War College today, they teach the shit out of Mahan, you know, but they don't teach the social order that gave his view of military strategy meaning. They just teach the strategy part. And I'm not convinced that that leads to good outcomes, because it never had any purpose to begin with, except for the maintenance of hierarchical orders based on these essentialist things that we find absolutely repugnant in the way we think about the world today.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I take Mahan as a representative of what I call the first generation of Atlantic Realists, which includes Rotzel and Reinsch and Max Weber, and who are essentially, you know, outlining. In German, it's Weltpolitik. In America, it's the notion that America has to be a world power, and that only certain cultures are fit to be so.
Yeah. You had a quote that I want to quote and just get you to unpack,
Sure.
explain, because I thought it was very insightful, and whatever you have to say about this will be useful. You say, quote, "The idea of realism in the US in the 1940s became a semantic refuge from a geopolitics tarnished by its association with its Nazi enemy." End quote. What do you mean by that? What's going on there?
Well, basically, what I found was that there was this crazy moment in American life in 1942, 1943, when Reader's Digest and Life magazine were in a wild panic over the alleged Nazi superweapon of geopolitics. And I thought to myself, how could geopolitics be completely othered and treated as this kind of specific, sort of German specialty? And American figures like Isaiah Bowman, who essentially were geopoliticians, they called themselves political geographers, but there's more similarity than difference. Were deeply discomfited by the association of their discipline with Nazi imperialism. And so geopolitics became demonized, it became feared, it became tainted. Bowman did not want to be known as America's Haushofer. Karl Haus reference to Karl Haushofer. This was all very bad PR for geography.
Haushofer, German Nazi leading geopolitician.
Coming out of a military background in World War I. I don't think there was a realist conspiracy to conceal debts to Carl Schmitt or Carl Schmitt on Grossraum or Ratzel on Lebensraum or Haushofer on geopolitics. But so it's a kind of a speculative point to say that there are strong continuities between fin de siècle geopolitics, interwar geopolitics, including Anglo-American geopolitics, which the Germans admired. And I show that Karl Haushofer and the Germans believed that they were behind the Americans and the British. And so what I want to say is, when Morgenthau and his generation begins to lecture Americans on how a woolly-headed Wilsonianism has blinded them to the sort of the truths of geopolitics and power politics. The problem with that is that it reinscribes this kind of myth of American innocence, right? That, if it were not for the emigres who brought with them Bismarckian realpolitik and this kind of sense of the tragic and the tragic conflicts between power and morality, that we would just be these woolly-headed idealists. And I think I think a sober view of interwar U.S. foreign policy, I'm thinking of the works of Benjamin Coates on legalist empire, but also Juan Pablo Scarfi on the American Society of International Law, and people like Elihu Root. These were legalist imperialists. These were not naive idealists who knew nothing of geopolitics. So the irony of this panic about geopolitics, the foreignness of geopolitics in the 1940s, is that it denied that America had ever been geopolitical. And so my somewhat
like, what was the Monroe Doctrine?
Exactly. And so my somewhat speculative claim is that realism is able to is able to sort of take off as a language, as the name of a paradigm, in part because it's a refuge from this discredited, because the World War II has discredited geopolitics as German. It has named it and nationalized it, when in fact it was international.
I can't pronounce this guy's name for the life of me. Nicholas Guillot. Yes, he's with us. He's a great scholar.
Yes.
He had this Cambridge book on, like, realist origins in IR.
Yep.
Covering mid-century period, and it was excellent in many ways. And so I just wanted to kind of like clarify your critique of his critique. So
right,
he says that realism is a counter-Enlightenment kind of ideology, like it's fundamentally conservative, accepts political hierarchies, right? Grim view of humanity's ability to like do progress. And this is where I need you to like confirm or adjust. Like, you say that realism is it can be those things, like it can be counter-Enlightenment, but it's also this way of advocating for geopolitics in this American context where geopolitics has taken on the dirty connotation. Is that correct?
My main critique is that it still locates realism firmly in the 30s and 40s. The breakthrough for realism in the 1930s and 40s. I think for him, realism is very closely related to neoliberalism, and he also, I also don't find the paradigm of counter-Enlightenment, I find a little bit too broad, sort of like too large a hammer for hitting a nail. My main critique is simply that it leaves out this period that I'm interested in, of the 1880s to the 1930s, which I think is a really important part of that story. But his story is complementary to mine, and I don't really have, I don't disagree with much of his characterization of what I call the mid-century modern moment of realism. I think he gets right, but I want to add this additional chapter.
Dan Nexon, who's a friend of the pod, professor at Georgetown, I've heard him say a few times that realists are just pessimistic liberals, or like he's floating that as like a provisional characterization. And I don't necessarily disagree, but like it also kind of depends on which realism you're talking about and what you mean by liberal. So what do you think of that? Realists or pessimistic liberals?
I think it's helpful in describing the fact that many Cold War realists were also Cold War liberals. And it's interesting because I think that a lot of my peers who sort of gravitate towards realism as an antidote to the ills of Cold War U.S. foreign policy and post-Cold War U.S. foreign policy, I think downplay the connections between realism and liberalism. For them, it's the sins of the Cold War liberals can be addressed by becoming more realist, right? Just as you said before, like this is the shelf ready, we've got an alternate, that realism is somehow untainted by liberalism of the Cold War, of its kind of messianic, version in the Cold War, or its unipolar moment. And so I guess I would agree with Dan that the affinity between that realism and liberalism are part of the same family. I mean, Beate Jahn has a great argument in which she says that, you know, realism realism is sort of the disavowed shadow side of liberalism. That liberalism practices power politics, in fact, but has a bad conscience about it. And so it disavows it and projects it outwards as if it were something completely separate. In my narrative, realism and liberalism are two faces of empire. So I think that that notion of realism as a pessimistic liberalism is consistent with my argument that realism and liberal internationalism are two faces of empire. Now, maybe Dan wouldn't go in that direction, or maybe he would. But I guess I would look for a more structural reading of realism and liberalism rather than relying on a psychological characterization of a sort of pessimism.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, what's interesting is in IR theory, just purely in the nuts and bolts of theory making, the community of IR scholars has kind of come around, has unquestionably come around to a framing that says, you know, realism and liberalism are both rationalist projects. You know, it's rationalist ontology all the way down. And so in that sense, they're extremely similar. It denies a social ontology in that sense, and which makes it so, you know, such a contrast with constructivism or relational theory or like Marxism or critical theory. And that's a different toolkit of reasoning to come out in basically the same place, which is that realism and liberalism have a lot in common. And you look at the practice of like grand strategy, you know, primacy is a grand strategy of basically offensive realism, and liberal hegemony. I've been struggling with this a lot lately. Liberal hegemony, particularly as practiced by the United States, is primacy with a lot of liberal rhetoric. It's primacy that accounts also for institutions, but it is the same ontology. Like there's a lot of like bending over backwards to stress differences between these two things, that like the differences are much smaller than the similarities in a way. And you can explain, there's more than one reason for that, I guess. It's interesting to note.
Yeah, completely. And I think that's why I'm frustrated by left realists, you know, because they think that that represents
That's a great point. Yeah.
You know, an Archimedean point, or, you know, position outside, when in fact it's just kind of, you know, part of the same century of imperial thinking.
You know, Carl Schmitt, you mentioned him a couple times, famous, infamous Nazi political theorist. He did some very impactful work in spite of that. And then Hans Morgenthau, obviously father of classical realism in the US, the guy who constructed out of thin air a historical genealogy that goes back to the Peloponnesian War or whatever. What was their relationship to each other? Like, what was Schmitt's impact on Morgenthau?
The influence went both ways. I mean, Morgenthau,
they knew each other.
They knew each other. There are very few letters that you can read in the Library of Congress, Morgenthau papers. But you know, Morgenthau believed that Carl Schmitt had plagiarized key ideas from his dissertation, and that these William Shoreman has written about this, that you can, if you look at the two different versions of the concept of the political, you can arguably see, you know, that Schmitt, you know, stole some ideas from Morgenthau. But the basic Schmitt-Morgenthau argument is about the concept of the political, and the notion that, you know, so Concept of the Political was a book that Schmitt wrote in 1927. It comes out of the Weimar context, and it says that the central definition of the political is the friend-enemy relation, and you know, it sort of was this very stark vision of politics and of liberalism's constitutive inability to recognize unresolvable antagonisms between interests. And this is something that still preoccupies political theorists. There's a realist revival, and basically people who are frustrated with Rawls or Habermas or other deliberative Democrats say basically, you know, politics has elements of, you know, antagonism that can't be mitigated, that can't be addressed through reason or compromise. And so that's in part why Schmitt has been attractive to the left. So Morgenthau took those ideas, and in his Scientific Man versus Power Politics, he basically argues that Wilsonian liberalism shares this incapacity to recognize, you know, conflicts of interests that are not adjudicable, and that one needs to, you know, not exaggerate the faith in reason and in law to tame the political, right? That there's something kind of elemental and demonic even about the political sphere, that one can sort of make an effort to bring morality and power, or morality and politics, into some kind of balance, but that one really has to work around this this fundamental notion of a kind of conflictual universe that can't be mastered. This is what Guillot meant by the counter-enlightenment side of realism. So there's an awful lot of that in Morgenthau. I try to show that in his discussion of his critique of liberalism and liberalism's inability to deal with power politics, which we're all familiar with because we've heard this said about Wilsonianism. We've heard this said about, you know, if you're Dick Cheney or the neocons critiquing the UN as a talking shop, that's a similar kind of argument about the weakness of law, of reason, of deliberation to solve, you know, intractable political conflicts.
Yeah, I mean, if you're doing politics wrong if you don't orient yourself toward enemies. I mean, you got it. Like, that's kind of like, that's the long and short of my takeaway of Schmitt. And that's the part of Schmitt that people seem to really like.
Yeah, I mean, my leftist friends would say, you know, a good class politics includes a class enemy, right? Having done some organizing as a lecturer in universities, I understand, you know, the power of you know, identifying you know, an enemy in a kind of class struggle. But I think my problem with this is that I think that's not the totality of politics, right? Politics is not only about you know, naming an enemy and mobilizing around it. I don't think that part of Schmitt was was very dear to Morgenthau, though, the enemy component part.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you actually, like, about Morgenthau's political evolution, because, like, how would you characterize it? And you just started to get at it there, like, because in the Vietnam War years, he was very networked with leftist organizations, like Institute for Policy Studies and others too. Like, so what was he just the same thing the whole time, and the shit that was going on around him changed, or did he have like a political evolution? I know towards the end he was advocating a world state. I mean,
Scheuermann argues that there's some movement towards a more cosmopolitan perspective, in the early 60s, 1961. Others are very impressed with, Morgenthau's early and vocal dissent from the Vietnam War. And so I think there was, I don't think his position on Vietnam really shows a significant shift, because his grounds for being against the war were that it was not in the national interest.
Yeah, this is his
right?
magic construct. Yeah.
So I think, this is something I've wrestled with a lot, because, William Scheuermann has written really powerful books arguing for Morgenthau as a progressive, as someone who is more cosmopolitan than has been recognized, who was right on Vietnam. My argument is that, he did a lot of damage, even if he, later became a dissenter from the policies that flowed from the Cold War. I think that, as I said earlier, it's not just the Cold War liberals who are to blame for Vietnam and the Cold War. It's also the Cold War realists. And, he doesn't have he was embraced by the left because he came from government, but he didn't have a principled anti-imperialist stance.
Yeah.
On Vietnam or other issues. My other critique of Morgenthau is that, I try to show in my chapter, which I call An American Power Politics, that he rejected German power politics, but he invented an American power politics. And I think that, if you, through my kind of close reading of his texts, I argue that that it's a little bit unfair that he tried to have his cake and eat it too. He tried to be popular and accessible, but then complained that he had been misunderstood and the nuances had been lost. And I'm not the only person to have argued that. Oliver Utrersonk makes a similar argument.
You made a good point about his 6 principles of political realism. This is kind of an aside, but it kind of reinforces what you're saying. Like that is like the most important thing that was pulled from his book, Politics Among Nations, but it was kind of like incidental to it or happenstance.
Yeah, I can't recall exactly. I think the publisher may have encouraged that, but that was something that he, it's interesting. Both Kennan and Morgenthau, really set these paradigms in motion, but then, became very disenchanted with the orthodox realism that flowed. And I try to argue that Morgenthau has to take responsibility for realism's moment of high orthodoxy in the 50s.
I had John Delury on the show recently about his book Agents of Subversion, and he's not an IR scholar, he's like a China historian, but his recent book had a whole chapter on like realist intellectual history, in the early Cold War. And we talked about it a little bit on the pod, but he commented at one point that he thinks the pernicious thing about Henry Kissinger was that Kissinger popularized stripping realism of its ethical content. And the people who are trying to be saviors of Hans Morgenthau or like venerate him today, they try to stress that like things like Politics Among Nations had ethical content. So like, what do you make of that? Do you think the thing about Kissinger is right, but also like, you know, ethical realism generally, is that a little bit of a trap or a resource?
I mean, I respect the people who want to insist that Morgenthau had a strong ethical compass. I mean, he certainly did. I don't think that the mediations that he proposed between ethics and foreign policy, or ethics and power politics, were extremely productive mediations. I think they were quite static and sort of doomed to fail, and so ethics is always sort of the add-on. But I mean, the people who urge a return to Morgenthau are sometimes coming from neo-realism, right, where the system, rather than the nation level politician or decision maker, is at the center. And so, I'm quite happy that neoclassical realists are interested in prudent decision making and sort of putting more agency into the hands of politicians. I think that's all to the good. It's just I think that it's still a very thin, sort of a thin gruel.
It's not enough.
That prudential realism is, of course, it's good to be prudent. There are also other intellectual traditions for counseling prudence. So yes, prudence is a good thing. Ethics is a good thing, but I think that this notion of ethical realism, or the classical realism has all the answers, again, is neglecting realism's blind spots.
Yeah. Yes. And this actually is a good, I wanted to talk a little bit about the fact that you and I are you and I are two of very few people who have written about progressive foreign policy and realism, or like thinking about these two things at the same time. And you have this fantastic piece in Dissent magazine, which is called Realism's Imperial Origins. And some of that obviously comes from the book, but you make some like unique points in there that are not necessarily made in the book, right? So you say that like the modern I got pings left and right, sorry. The modern realist restrainers are, quote, right to emphasize the correct value of the dissenting pragmatic strain of American realism. But the counsel of restraint, prudence, and other sensible virtues does not vindicate the much deeper claims about the nature of power, the political, the national, and the international that North Atlantic realists have made since the 1880s, when realism first emerged, end quote. I think I'm in violent agreement here, right? And this is recapitulating a little bit of what you said, but I mean, can you expand on that at all? Or?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I think that like my peers who are critics of U.S. foreign policy and who broadly align themselves with a restraint-oriented foreign policy, I see, I'm anti-militarist. I want to see less militarism and less, less hubris, less interventionism. but we should be consistent anti-imperialists. And part of my problem with the anti-hegemonic, Van, what you call the anti-hegemonic position, or what I refer to as the restraint position in my essay, is that they're not consistently anti-imperialist, and that they are quite pessimistic about and passive in the face of other imperialism. So I'm pro-restraint, but not because the world is as the classical realists or neo-realists describe it.
Yes,
I think that a thin prudential realism is appealing, and dialing back, the forever war and make and primacy, the conceit of primacy, or the objective of primacy. But I don't think that it requires or vindicates a realist ontology. And so I sort of worry about all this talk about the inevitability of great power competition and the need to accommodate our rivals as American hegemony wanes.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, I don't know if I even have any.
So I end up arguing I think I'm not saying restraint is wrong, therefore we need to be liberal internationalists. I'm saying let's find a position beyond liberal internationalism and a restraint grounded in realism. Now, I did speak to Stephen Wertheim about this, and he sort of urged me to disaggregate those two and to say that restraint is a grand strategy that doesn't necessarily depend on realism. And so I take that point, and that's why I say that I would hate to see the wise aspects of restraint vindicate the thicker ontological claims about the nature of international affairs, the cyclical philosophy of history, and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, so there's certainly convergence between a kind of anti-imperial, anti-liberal hegemonic foreign policy, progressive grand strategy preference, and certain preferences within classical realism or neoclassical realism. But I would not, as a progressive person, I would not want realism to be defining the horizon of statecraft, or like how far our foreign policy vision goes, what we're trying, the world we're trying to make, for, lack of a better, that's my phrase in the journal article. Like, I don't want realism defining the world that we're trying to make. And so, like, to the extent restraint is a grand strategy, which would imply that it's like internally coherent, it has to own up to who benefits from the restraint actions that you take. And you have to have that somewhat foregrounded, because if you don't, then a restraint that benefits in the extreme, Putin, Nazi Germany, Assad, whatever, it takes you in a direction where you're kind of world making in a bad way, in a not children of the Enlightenment way, in a not progressive way. I thought you said that well. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, on sort of going back to your point about psychology, I mean, I sort of wonder whether this kind of refusal of world making reflects an anxiety about a politics of hope, about pursuing any kind of real world making project that might turn out to be another God that failed. I think that we need to be a little bit bolder and more hopeful and that's why I liked the section of your paper on the progressive pragmatists and their aspiration to make a world more social democratic, more equal, and so forth. And it seems like the restraint grand strategy or anti-hegemonic grand strategy is has more of a negative vision, of what to restrain rather than what to create.
Yeah, I mean, the way I thought, I can't remember if I put this explicitly in the paper, but I thought of all three progressive grand strategies as cashing out as versions of restraint. They're all restraint grand strategies, but in different ways with different front-loaded principles, and then like any strategy, each has its own configuration of risks that it's willing to accept, and that anti-hegemonic grand strategy, it is like you say, it's the risk there is like they don't want to take the risk that a progressive pragmatist orientation would take, because maybe they have grim expectations about what happens when you try to do good things. I don't know. And so the surest bet for that anti-hegemonic view is to just literally like do less, accommodate yourself to things as they are, presumptively because that's as good as it gets.
Can I ask you a question that's been bothering me or on my mind? Is what do you think about the idea of great power competition as the sort of meta narrative of where we are? Does that feel well? I guess you had that. I guess you have that piece with Michael Brennis that's beginning to get into that. But I wonder, because I feel like there's so much talk about the return of. It just seems to me that realism is becoming fashionable again, because we believe that that history is binary. It's sort of, you're either in this integrative globalizing mode, or you're in this this model of great power competition. And I just don't know, since I'm not an IR scholar, I want to know sort of what to me it sounds like a repeat of a very old discourse. But what would be the defense of that as a paradigm for thinking about?
It's rhetorically lazy. Like Nexon has actually made some good points on this. It's like it's a language or a rhetoric that substitutes for, or it describes a framework of great power rivalry. And in that sense, it is implicitly realist, certainly rationalist. It is geopolitics in action, but without kind of owning up to the full ontology that's being smuggled in. And so one of the ways that we're erring right now, I think, and Mike Brennis and I are working on a new book about this that expands on that foreign affairs piece, is the idea that like great Democrats in particular, Republicans are like going off the rails. Like they're anti-democratic in many respects now, but the Democrats have this wager with foreign policy that they've started coalescing around that says great power competition, which is to say great power rivalry, which is to say an embrace of geopolitics and realism, is how you get a new great society, is how you get New Deal Order 2.0. And that requires a really, really fucked up reading of the Cold War and of New Deal history. It requires an extremely cherry-picked arc of history that erases all the risks that we took to make that happen, all of the hierarchy that we had to impose and perpetuate to keep that kind of order going. There was no New Deal order without having a wife at home, right? Suppressing the feminist movement, basically. You couldn't have lots of high-wage working class jobs in a factory, to say nothing of the fact that unionization then, compared to now, it's just a different universe, right? And so Democrats have this extremely bad and dangerous theory that mostly cashes out in favor of elites, particularly like oligarchs and foreign policy elites. Like the Washington establishment benefits uniquely from great power competition. It's a job program for Kennedy School graduates who learned a little bit of Mandarin, right? And that's fucking what it is. That, and, you know, ununionized workers who are going to build semiconductors, it seems like, and getting, you know, shit wages and shit conditions. And that's the bet. And like, that's not going to work out, particularly because like what we saw in the Cold War was we went all in on this like anti-Soviet bet. We have the National Defense Education Act and all this stuff, you know? So like that's the historical basis for thinking you can get public goods out of having a geopolitical foe. You know, we Sputnik, you know, technological innovation, but like that ignores how different the world, the social order was then. And that's a social order we don't want to repeat, but also by reaffirming and amplifying the Soviet threat, we gave the Republicans the opportunity to say, oh, we agree with the Soviet threat. Our theory for how to defeat the threat, and now that we're in power, we're going to fucking do it. Our theory for defeating the threat is to starve the welfare state. It is neoliberalism. It is austerity. It is, we can't afford to fight the war on poverty. Who cares about poverty when you've got the big red menace, the big bad, you know? And so like, there's a way in which signing on to this like big geopolitical foe project really screwed over the very thing that Democrats wanted and think that they're getting again. And they're missing that history. I
see.
So that was a long explanation, but like, that's the thrust of like what I think is wrong with that. And great power competition is simply an idiom in which they're expressing this return to realism without being accountable for all that comes with a return to realism. And an offensive kind of realism too. Kind of like, this is what's so funny. It's kind of the Atlantic realism, the version that's really about domination and empire. And like, that's very different from restraint realism, you know?
Yeah. And I try to allow that there are dissenting moments in realism's history, that there is this what Jackson Lears calls the pragmatic realist tradition in American history. But I think these are marginal compared with the larger story of realism's imperial investments. And so that's why I come at this from a bit of a different angle than some of my contemporaries.
Really fascinating stuff. I had one other big question, sort of, about, we've both read this Australian progressive foreign policy thing. There was a journal article a year or two ago about it's channeling the Australian perspective specifically, but it was like a 6-author project. And they were trying to define what they called the progressive realism for Australian foreign policy. What were your thoughts about that in broad terms? Like, there were things that converged with what I was doing and with what you're talking about, but it was also its own thing.
I have to confess, it's been a little while since I read it. I remember reading it and thinking myself in agreement with what was proposed, and yet still sort of uncomfortable with the label. But if you could refresh my memory about what are some of the
well, so that was my to the extent I thought it was a very good piece, and it's interesting to see a convergence just by organic convergence across the pond or whatever on like progressively minded thinking about foreign policy. That one of my hangups was that like they're using realism, but it wasn't clear what aspect of realism they were tapping into, particularly because the progressivism that they were tapping into was a redistributive progressivism, a redistribution of resources, a redistribution of power. Any social democratic function is, of course, going to have redistribution, like of material resources. But realism is a power hoarding idiom. It's not, you don't share power, you know? I guess there's times when you can make accommodations within realism, but they were using the rhetoric of realism, and it wasn't clear which aspect they were tapping into when they did that. But I also questioned, as part of that, like, were they was there a political reason for invoking a realist brand? Like, is there something going on in Australian strategic culture that makes this more sellable by appending realism to it? You know, like the way in the US we would talk about pragmatism, being practical, being realistic, you know, like, is it that kind of thing? And so that was all unclear to me.
Well, I mean, having talked to George Lawson a little bit about this, I think that he feels that there are some resources for progressive realism in thinkers like E.H. Carr that have not been, because there is a left dimension to E.H. Carr's thought. So I have a dim memory of the article. I apologize for not rereading it, but I feel like there was some of that E.H. Carr influenced idea about sort of bringing things into equilibrium, sort of bringing politics into equilibrium with economics, or bringing there was something sort of about the sort of economic substructure that that represented the real and needed to be taken seriously. But it also makes sense to me that realism is as I try to show in my book, realism is the default setting, and then we sort of decorate it with adjectives like progressive, ethical, and so on. So I'm skeptical about the prospect of a truly progressive realism for the reasons I've suggested in my book, but I am very interested in the dialogue, and I've learned a great deal from Scheuermann's work on interpreting the mid-century classical realists as being more friendly to the world state than we've recognized, more cosmopolitan. So I'm open to that dialogue. It's just I keep running up against, as I said, these blind spots or weaknesses in realist theory. I don't think they have a real theory of the state. I don't think they have a very sophisticated view of political economy, and so I don't find it to be the go-to place for reinventing a progressive foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't plant a flag in cosmopolitanism or anything. That's not even an orientation in my mind. But I do have a piece coming out with the title. I think it's "Real Security is Beyond the National Interest," and I think that's the thing I keep coming up against. Like you said, with realism, is like it's about that horizon. Like it's conceivable that we would agree on so many things, but we cannot hand over our political vision and the imaginary of world making to the realists, because they confine us to this arbitrary boundary of the national interest, and like real security requires going further than that. There are many ways to cut into that, but that's the minimum, I think, in my mind. Yeah. Okay. Well, this has been a long one, man. Yikes. Okay. Well, all right. Well, we'll stay in touch. This has been great.
Seriously, I'm learning a lot from you.
I appreciate that. Same here. The Atlantic Realists, get it while it's hot, or even after it's not hot anymore. All right, Matthew Specter, thanks for coming on the show, man. This has been great.
Great to be here. Thank you so much.
All right.